Continuing Saint Joan of Arc by Mark Twain. To find her guilty, whether she was guilty or not, she must be convicted out of her own mouth, there being no other way to accomplish it. Every advantage that learning has over ignorance, age over youth, experience over inexperience, chicane over artlessness, every trick and trap, engine devisable by malice, and the cunning of sharp intellects practised in setting snares for the unwary, all these were employed against her without shame. And when these arts were one by one defeated by marvelous intuitions of her alert and penetrating mind, Bishop Cacon stooped to a final baseness which it degrades human speech to describe. A priest who pretended to come from the region of her own home, and to be a pitying friend, and anxious to help her in her sore need, was smuggled into her cell, and he misused his sacred office to steal her confidence. She confided to him the things sealed from revealment by her voices, and which her prosecutors had tried so long in vain to trick her into betraying. A concealed confederate set it all down and delivered it to Cacon, who used Joan's secrets, and thus obtained for her ruin. Throughout the trials, whatever the foredoomed witness said was twisted from its true meaning when possible, and made to tell against her. And whenever an answer of hers was beyond the reach of twisting it, was not allowed to go upon the record. It was upon one of these latter occasions that she uttered that pathetic reproach to Cacon. Ah, you set down everything that is against me, but you will not set down what is for me. That this untrained young creature's genius for war was wonderful, and her generalship worthy to rank with the ripe products of a tried and trained military experience. We have the sworn testimony of two of her veteran subordinates, one, the Duc d'Alencon, the other, the greatest of the French generals of the time, Dunois, bastard of Orleans. I'm not sure about French pronunciation a lot of times, so that her genius was as great, possibly even greater, in the subtle warfare of the forum. We have for witness the records of the Rouen trials, that protracted exhibition of intellectual fence, maintained with credit against the masterminds of France that her moral greatness was pure to her intellect. We call the Rouen trials again to witness, with their testimony to a fortitude which patiently and steadfastly endured 12 weeks the wasting forces of captivity, chains, loneliness, sickness, darkness, hunger, thirst, cold, shame, insult, abuse, broken sleep, treachery, ingratitude, exhausting sieges of cross-examination, the threat of torture with the rack before her, and the executioner standing ready, yet never surrendering, never asking quarter, the frail wreck of her, as unconquerable the last day as was her invincible spirit the first. Great as she was in so many ways, she was perhaps even greatest of all in the lofty things just named. Her patient endurance, her steadfastness, her granite fortitude. We may not hope to easily find her mate and twin in these majestic qualities. Where we lift our eyes highest, we find only a strange and curious contrast. There in the captive eagle beating his broken wings on the rock of St. Helena. Did they name Mount St. Helens by this time? Maybe they waited a while. I'm not sure what year they named it Mount St. Helens, but that. But that's a, this is a different place being referred to. Chapter 3. The trials ended with her condemnation, but as she conceded nothing, confessed nothing, this was a victory for her, defeat for Cacon. But his evil resources were not yet exhausted. She was persuaded to agree to sign a paper of slight import. Then, by treachery, a paper was substituted which contained a recantation and a detailed confession of everything which had been charged against her during the trials, and denied and repudiated by her persistently during the 3 months. And this false paper she ignorantly signed. This was a victory for Kokon. He followed it eagerly and piteously up by at once setting a trap for her which she could not escape. When she realized this, she gave up the long struggle, denounced the treason which had been practiced against her, repudiated the false confession, reasserted the truth of the testimony which she had given in the trials. And went to her martyrdom with the peace of God in her tired heart, and on her lips endearing words and loving prayers for the cur she had crowned, and the nation of ingrates she had saved. When the fires rose about her, and she begged for a cross for her dying lips to kiss, it was not a friend but an enemy, not a Frenchman but an alien, not a comrade in arms but an English soldier, that answered that pathetic prayer. He broke a stick across his knee, bound the pieces together in the form of the symbol she so loved, and gave it her, and his gentle deed is not forgotten, nor will be. The 4th chapter. 25 years afterwards, the process of rehabilitation was instituted, there being a growing doubt as to the validity of a sovereignty that had been rescued and set up upon its feet by a person who had been proved by the church to be a witch and a familiar of evil spirits. Joan's old generals, her secretary, several aged relations, and other villagers of Domremy, surviving judges and secretaries of the Rouen and Poitiers processes, a cloud of witnesses, some of whom had been her enemies and persecutors, came and made oath and testified, and what they said was written down. In that sworn testimony, the moving and beautiful history of Joan of Arc is laid bare, from her childhood to her martyrdom. From the verdict she rises stainlessly pure, in mind and heart, in speech and deed and spirit, and will so endure to the end of time. She is the wonder of the ages, and when we consider her origin, her early circumstances, her sex, and that she did all the things upon which her renown rests while she was still a young girl, we recognize that while our race continues, she will be also the riddle of the ages. When we set about accounting for a Napoleon, or a Shakespeare, or a Raphael, or a Wagner, or an Edison, or other extraordinary person, we understand that the measure of his talent will not explain the whole result, nor even the largest part of it. No, it was the atmosphere in which the talent was cradled that explains. It is the training which it received while it grew, the nurture that it got from reading, studying, example, the encouragement it gathered from self-recognition, and recognition from the outside at each stage of its development. Yeah, it's mostly what you do with things, right? When we know all these details, then we know why the man was ready when his opportunity came. We should expect Edison's surroundings and atmosphere to have the largest share in discovering him to himself and to the world, and we should expect him to live and die undiscovered in a land where an inventor could find no comradeship, no sympathy, no ambition-rousing atmosphere of recognition and applause. Dahomey, for instance, Dahomey could not find an Edison out, and in Dahomey, an Edison could not find himself out. Broadly speaking, genius is not born with sight, but blind, and is not itself that opens its eyes, but the subtle influences of a myriad of stimulating exterior circumstances. And we find that, for example, people who either learn musical instruments or music in general even have higher, that helps increase the IQ, and it increases the IQ further when it's you know entirely vocal and scripture and full of meaning, and then you have to get it exactly right. Um, all that Quranic and Vedic and Avestan and whatnot stuff actually helps with the intelligence. I'm sure there's other examples, but Gregorian and stuff isn't as precise, so it's not. I mean, it's better than you know just wasting your time, but you know what I mean. Um, we all know this to be not a guess, but a mere commonplace fact, a truism. Lorraine was Joan of Arc's Dahomey, and there the riddle confronts us. We can understand how she could be born with military genius, with leonine courage, with incomparable fortitude, with a mind which was, in several particulars, a prodigy, a mind which included among its specialities the lawyer's gift of detecting traps laid by the adversary in cunning and treacherous arrangements of seemingly innocent words, the orator's gift of eloquence, the advocate's gift of presenting a case in clear and compact form, the judge's gift of sorting and weighing evidence, finally something recognizable as more than a mere trace of the statesman's gifts in understanding a political situation and how to make a profitable use of such opportunities as it offers. We can comprehend how she could be born with these great qualities, but we cannot comprehend how they became immediately unusable and effective without the developing forces of a sympathetic atmosphere and the training which comes of teaching, study, practice, years of practice, and the crowning and perfecting help of 1,000 mistakes. We can understand how the possibilities of the future perfect peach are all lying hid in the humble bitter almond, but we can not conceive of the peach springing directly from the almond without the intervening long season of patient cultivation and development. Now, whatever some of these pits, also some of those pits you can't eat. And I don't mean that it's not just pleasant, but yeah. Um, Out of a cattle pasturing peasant village, lost in the remoteness of an unvisited wilderness and atrophied with ages of stupefaction and ignorance, we cannot see a Joan of Arc issue equipped to the last detail for her amazing career, and hope to be able to explain the riddle of it, labor at it as we may. It is beyond us. All the rules fail in this girl's case. In the world's history, she stands alone, quite alone. Others have been great in their first public exhibitions of generalship, valor, legal talent, diplomacy, fortitude, but always their previous years and associations had been, in a larger or smaller degree, a preparation for these things. There have been no exceptions to the rule, but Joan was competent in a law case at 16 without ever having seen a law book or a courthouse before. She had no training in soldiership and no associations with it, yet she was a competent general in her first campaign. She was brave in her first battle, yet her courage had no education, not even the education which a boy's courage gets from never ceasing reminders that it is not permissible for a boy to be a coward, but only in a girl. Friendless, alone, ignorant in the blossom of her youth, she sat, week after week, a prisoner in chains, before her assemblage of judges, enemies hunting her to her death, and the ablest minds in France, and answered them out of an untaught wisdom which overmatched their learning, baffled their tricks and treacheries with a native sagacity which compelled their wonder, and scored every day a victory against these incredible odds, and camped unchallenged on the field in the history of the human intellect, untrained and experienced, and using only its birthright equipment of untried capacities. There is nothing which approaches this. Joan of Arc stands alone, and must continue to stand alone by reason of the unfellowed fact that in the things wherein she was great, she was so without shade. Our suggestion of help from preparatory teaching, practice, environment, our experience. There is no one to compare her with, none to measure her by, for all others among the illustrious grew toward their high place in an atmosphere and surroundings which discovered their gift to them and nourished it and promoted it, intentionally or unconsciously. There have been other young generals, but they were not girls. Young generals, but they had been soldiers before they were generals. She began as a general. She commanded the first army she ever saw. She led it from victory to victory and never lost a battle with it. There have been young commanders-in-chief, but none so young as she. She is the only soldier in history who has held the supreme command of a nation's armies at the age of 17. Her history has still another feature which sets her apart and leaves her without fellow or competitor. There have been many uninspired prophets, but she was the only one who ever ventured the daring detail of naming, along with a foretold event, the event's precise nature, the special time limit within which it would occur, and the place, and scored fulfillment. At Vaucouleurs, she said she must go to the king and be made his general, and break the English power, and it crowned her sovereign at Rheims. It all happened, it was all to happen next year, and it did. She foretold her first wound and its character and the date a month in advance, and the prophecy was recorded in a public record book 3 weeks in advance. She repeated it the morning of the date named, and it was fulfilled before night. At Tours, she foretold the limit of her military career, saying it would end in 1 year from the time of its utterance, and she was right. She foretold her martyrdom using that word and naming a time 3 months away, and again she was right. At a time when France seemed hopelessly and permanently in the hands of the English, she twice asserted in her prison before her judges that within 7 years the English would meet with a mightier disaster than had been the fall of Orleans. It happened within 5, the fall of Paris. Other prophecies of her came true, both as to the event named and the time limit prescribed. She was deeply religious and believed that she had daily speech with angels. Well, in English things are about ambiguous, but the light beings are not gendered things, so that can kind of cue you in. That she saw them face to face, and that they counseled her, comforted her, and heartened her, and brought commands to her direct from God. She had a childlike faith in the heavenly origin of her apparitions and her voices, and not any threat of any form of death that was able to frighten it out of her loyal heart. She was a beautiful and simple and lovable character. In the records of the trials, this comes out in clear and shining detail. She was gentle and winning and affectionate. She loved her home and friends and her village life. She was miserable in the presence of pain and suffering. She was full of compassion. On the field of her most splendid victory, she forgot her triumphs to hold in her lap the head of a dying enemy, and comfort his passing spirit with pitying words. In an age when it was common to slaughter prisoners, she stood dauntless between hers and harm that saved them alive. She was forgiving, generous, unselfish, magnanimous. She was pure from all spot or stain of baseness, and always she was a girl, and dear and worshipful as is meet for that estate. When she fell wounded the first time, she was frightened and cried when she saw her blood gushing from her breast. But she was Joan of Arc. And when presently she found that her generals were sounding the retreat, she staggered to her feet and laid the assault again, and took that place by storm. There is no blemish in that rounded and beautiful character. How strange it is that almost invariably the artist remembers only one detail, one minor and meaningless detail of the personality of Joan of Arc, to wit, that she was a peasant girl, and forgets all the rest. And so he paints her as a strapping, middle-aged fishwoman with costume to match, and in her face the spirituality of a ham. He is slave to his one idea and forgets to observe that the supremely great souls are never lodged in gross bodies. Well, she was 18. That was I can understand a few years early because of the circumstance, but not the circumstance that would make somebody look twice their age. But how can you see? You don't see the spirituality by people's mere expression. If people are exhausted and whatnot, that doesn't mean much of anything. You know, the aura, and all that. He is slave to his one idea and forgets to observe that the supremely great souls are never lodged in gross bodies. No brawn, no muscle could endure the work that their bodies must do. They do their miracles by the Spirit, which has 50 times the strength and staying power of brawn and muscle. The Napoleons are little, not big, and they work 20 hours in the 24 and come up fresh, while the big soldiers with the little hearts faint around them with fatigue. We know what Joan of Arc was like. Without asking merely by what she did, the artist should paint her spirit. Then he could not fail to paint her body aright. She would rise before us, then a vision to win us, not repel, a lithe, young slender figure, indistinct, with the unbought grace of youth, dear and bonny and lovable, the face beautiful and transfigured with the light of that lustrous intellect, and the fires of that unquenchable spirit, taking into account, as I have suggested before, all circumstances of her origin, youth, sex, illiteracy, early environment, and the obstructing conditions under which he exploited her high gifts and made her conquest in the field and before the courts that tried her for her life. She is easily and by far the most extraordinary person the human race has ever produced.